The clerk had already reached for Natalie's marriage paperwork when Tommy Vance, the man my daughter was about to marry, calmly said, "We've known each other for 30 years. Natalie was 29, and the look on her face told me she had never heard that number before either. Until that moment, I had been doing everything I could to behave like the supportive mother of a grown woman instead of the worried mother who thought 9 months was awfully fast to know someone before marriage. Natalie Holloway had always made her own decisions. At 29, she had built a successful career as a corporate event planner, lived independently, and rarely asked Michael or me for permission about anything. So when she told us she was getting married after 9 months of dating, I kept my concerns measured. I had asked whether she felt certain. She had smiled and told me that 9 months with the right person could reveal more than years with the wrong one. I respected that answer, even if it did not erase every question in my mind. That morning in Richmond, Natalie had looked completely sure of herself. Her long dark blonde hair fell in soft waves around the shoulders of her burgundy blazer, and she kept touching the engagement ring on her finger as we waited. I was there because she had asked me to come, not because she needed me to supervise anything. Michael had stayed home, saying this moment belonged to Natalie and the man she had chosen. Everything felt ordinary as the clerk checked their information and made casual conversation. "So, how long have you two been together?" she asked. 9 months, Natalie said. Almost at the same moment, her fiancé said, "We've known each other for 30 years. Then his expression tightened. "That came out wrong. I mean, our family's story started almost 30 years ago." The clerk stopped typing. I looked first at him, then at Natalie. For one strange second, nobody spoke. Natalie gave a small, confused laugh. 30 years? He did not laugh with her. Yes. Her expression changed immediately. "I'm 29. I know." That answer tightened something in my chest, but I forced myself to remain silent. This was Natalie's relationship, and whatever explanation existed, she deserved to ask for it herself. She turned fully toward him. "We met 9 months ago. You told me we'd never met before." "We hadn't, not the way you mean." Natalie glanced at the paperwork in front of her, then back at him. "Then what exactly do you mean?" He looked uncomfortable, but not confused. That distinction bothered me more than if he had simply misspoken. He knew exactly what he was referring to. The clerk quietly moved the paperwork aside and gave us a little privacy. I wanted to ask a dozen questions, but Natalie raised one hand slightly toward me without looking away from him. "Mom, please. Let me." I nodded. She took a slow breath. "Did you know something about me before I knew it about you?" He hesitated only a moment. "Natalie, I can explain." She looked down at the pen still resting beside the unfinished paperwork. Then she deliberately set it farther away. "Then explain before I sign anything." His eyes moved from Natalie to me and back again. For the first time that morning, he seemed to understand that the wedding paperwork was no longer a certainty. Natalie remained perfectly still, waiting. "Finally," he said quietly, "I should have told you before today." Natalie did not answer him right away. She looked toward the clerk, then at the other couples waiting nearby, and I could see her deciding that whatever came next did not belong at a public counter. "We need to step outside," she said. Her fiancé nodded without arguing. The three of us walked into the hallway, where Natalie stopped near a quiet seating area. I stayed several feet away, close enough if she wanted me but far enough to make it clear that this was her conversation. Natalie faced him. "I am going to ask you one question, and I need a direct answer." He nodded. "Did you know who I was before I knew there was any connection between us?" His expression tightened. "Yes." I watched the answer land. Natalie did not raise her voice. Somehow, her calm made the moment feel more serious. "When we met, I thought we were strangers. We were strangers in the sense that we had never actually met as adults." "That is not what I asked." He lowered his eyes briefly. "I know." Natalie folded her arms. "Did you know something about me that I did not know about you?" "Yes. That was enough to change the situation completely. Until then, I had still been hoping there was some harmless explanation involving a family story or an old coincidence. There still might have been, but harmless explanations did not require one person to carry information the other person did not have. I started to speak, but Natalie glanced toward me. "Mom, I need to handle this." There was no anger in her voice toward me, only a boundary. "All right," I said. "I am here." She turned back to him. "You had months to tell me." "I know. You asked me to marry you." "I know that too." "And you were going to let me sign those papers before telling me?" He shook his head. "No. I kept telling myself I would explain before we got here. Then the longer I waited, the harder it became to say without making the delay itself worse." Natalie gave him a tired look. "The delay is already worse." He accepted that without defending himself. She looked down at her engagement ring, slowly slid it from her finger, and held it in her palm. My stomach dropped, but she did not hand it to him. Instead, she slipped it carefully into the inside pocket of her burgundy blazer. "I am not giving this back today," she said. "And I am not signing anything today either." He nodded. "That is fair." "I am not asking what is fair to you." Natalie picked up her purse. "I need time to understand what you knew and why you thought I did not deserve to know it." He took a small step toward her, then stopped himself. "Natalie, please let me explain." "Not here. Not now." She turned toward me. "Mom, can we go?" "Of course." We had almost reached the end of the hallway when he called my name. I stopped, but Natalie kept walking a few steps before turning back. He was not looking at her anymore. He was looking directly at me. "Rebecca, there is something you need to understand before you decide what you think happened." I waited. His next words shifted the question away from him and toward the family I thought I knew better than anyone. "Michael knows why." By the time Natalie and I reached the Holloway home, my concern had shifted away from the man she was supposed to marry and toward my own husband. Natalie did not come inside. She said she needed a few hours alone and asked me not to call until she contacted me first. I respected that. When I entered the house, Michael was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. One look at my face made him set it down. "What happened?" he asked. I placed my purse on the counter. Natalie did not finish the paperwork. Michael stood. "Why?" I watched him carefully. Because her fiancé said something he should have told her months ago. Then, when we left, he told me that you knew why. Michael became very still. That reaction answered one question before I even asked it. "What does 30 years mean, Michael?" He rubbed one hand across his jaw and sat down again. "It does not mean what it sounds like." "Then tell me what it means." He has not known Natalie personally for 30 years. He could not have. He knew about her before she was born. For the first time since leaving the clerk's office, some of the pressure in my chest eased. The impossible part suddenly had a logical explanation, but relief lasted only a few seconds. How could he know about our daughter before she was born? Michael looked toward the window. Because I knew the Vance family. I pulled out the chair across from him. "I have never heard you mention them." "I know." "Were you involved with someone in his family?" "No." His answer was immediate. "There was no affair, Rebecca. There was no other child, and there is no biological connection between Natalie and the man she is engaged to. Nothing like that happened." I believed him, partly because Michael had not tried to soften or evade the answer. But that left the real question untouched. "Then what did happen?" He took a moment before answering, not to avoid me, but as if he were trying to decide where the story actually began. "When you were pregnant with Natalie, I went through a period I never told you about. I was scared about becoming a father. More scared than I let you see." I remembered Michael during those months as attentive, practical, sometimes quieter than usual, but I had never imagined that kind of fear beneath it. "What does that have to do with his family?" I met them during that time. His father helped me when I was struggling with some things I did not know how to say out loud. I showed them the ultrasound picture. Their son was there. He was just a little boy, but he heard us talking about the baby you were carrying. I stared at him. Natalie. Michael nodded. Natalie. The strange number finally made sense. Her fiancé had not somehow known my daughter for longer than she had been alive. As a child, he had known that Michael Holloway was waiting for a daughter to be born. That answered the question that had stopped everything at the clerk's office, but it created a different problem, one that belonged inside my own marriage. Michael and I had shared nearly 3 decades of raising Natalie, yet I had never heard this story once. Why do I not remember any of these people? I asked. Michael met my eyes. Because you never met them. I frowned. I was pregnant with Natalie. How was I not there? His voice became quieter. Because you were not there when it happened. Michael did not make me drag the explanation out of him. He told me that nearly 30 years earlier, while I was pregnant with Natalie, he had traveled to Norfolk for several days to help his older cousin close out a small business after a retirement. I remembered the trip. What I had never known was how frightened Michael had been when he left Richmond. Everyone kept telling me I was going to be a great father, he said, and every time they said it, I felt like I was fooling them. He had grown up believing that a good husband provided answers, not fears, so instead of telling me he was terrified of failing our child, he had tried to manage the fear alone. In Norfolk, the boy's father noticed Michael's anxiety and gave him something he had been unable to give himself, permission to be afraid without treating that fear as proof he would fail. Michael showed him the ultrasound photograph he carried in his wallet. His young son happened to be nearby and heard them talking about the daughter. Michael was waiting to meet. Before Michael left, his cousin took a casual snapshot of the 3 of them while Michael was still holding the ultrasound print. That was the entire connection. There was no promise between the families and no reason, at the time, to imagine their lives would ever cross again. Michael returned to Richmond several days later, and when Natalie was born, his fear gave way to the ordinary exhaustion and joy of learning how to care for a baby. Contact with the other family gradually faded. Then why did you never tell me? I asked. Michael looked genuinely ashamed. Because by the time I came home, I was embarrassed that I had been that afraid. You were carrying our daughter, dealing with everything that came with that, and I had spent days wondering whether I was capable of being her father. Once she was born, telling you felt pointless. Then a year passed. Then 5. Eventually it became something I had buried so deeply that I almost never thought about it. I understood the emotion behind his choice, but understanding was not the same as approving it. You decided I did not need to know. Yes, he said. There was no excuse attached to the word. That mattered, but it did not erase the omission. I thought about the man Michael had been then and the husband sitting across from me now. The old secret no longer frightened me. What concerned me was whether it had truly remained in the past. Michael, when Natalie first brought Tommy here, did you recognize him? His expression changed. It was subtle, but after nearly 3 decades together I knew the difference between remembering something painful and preparing to admit something current. I leaned forward. I am not asking about 30 years ago anymore. I am asking when you realized the man our daughter was dating was that little boy. Michael held my gaze. The hesitation itself told me the answer was not 9 months old, but it was not new either. I waited without repeating the question. Finally, he drew a breath to answer. Months ago, Michael said. He did not look away this time. I recognized him months ago. The answer was immediate, just as I had needed it to be, but it changed. The conversation more than anything he had told me about the past. How many months? I asked. A little after Natalie started bringing him around regularly. At first, I only thought he looked familiar. Then he mentioned his father's name, and I knew. I stared at him across our kitchen table. Did he recognize you? Yes. Not immediately, but he figured it out too. Michael explained that the two of them had spoken privately after one of Natalie's visits to our house. Her fiancé remembered the old photograph his father had eventually given him, which he still kept with his family papers at home, and the story attached to it. He and Michael confirmed that they were remembering the same family connection. "And neither of you told Natalie," I said. "I told him he needed to." "That is not the same thing." Michael nodded. "No. It is not." He said he had warned Natalie's fiancé that the connection might seem harmless to him, but once he knew about it, keeping it from Natalie changed its meaning. Michael had been specific. "Tell her before asking her to marry you." Her fiancé had agreed. Then the proposal happened, Natalie accepted, and Michael realized the conversation had never taken place. "Why did you still say nothing?" I asked. "Because I convinced myself it was his story to tell." Michael paused. "And because I did not want Natalie to think I was interfering in her relationship." I could understand the reasoning. That was what made it more troubling. Michael had not remained silent because he wanted to deceive our daughter. He had remained silent because he believed he was respecting a boundary. But somewhere along the way, he had confused respecting Natalie's relationship with allowing someone else to keep information from her. "You did this 30 years ago too," I said. Michael frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "You were afraid, so you decided I did not need to know. Now you knew something that affected Natalie, and you decided she did not need to hear it from you. Both times, you called silence protection after the fact." Michael sat back, absorbing that. "I never thought of it that way." "I know. I was not interested in punishing him for being afraid. Before Natalie was born. That man had been younger, uncertain, and ashamed of feelings he did not know how to express. But the decision from a few months ago belonged to the Michael sitting in front of me now. You do not get to decide what another adult can handle just because telling them might be uncomfortable," I said. "Not for me. Not for Natalie." "You are right." His answer did not repair anything, but at least he did not turn the conversation into an argument about his intentions. Before I could respond, the front door opened. Natalie stepped inside, still wearing her burgundy blazer. Her engagement ring was still absent from her finger. She looked tired, but the shock I had seen earlier had settled into something more deliberate. "I talked to him," she said. Michael rose from his chair. Natalie looked directly at her father. "I heard his version. Now I want to hear what Dad left out." Natalie did not sit down until Michael had told her exactly what he had just told me, when he recognized her fiancé, when the two men spoke privately, and why Michael chose not to interfere after telling him to explain the connection before proposing. She listened without interrupting, then lowered herself into the chair beside me. "So you knew before I got engaged?" Michael nodded. "Yes. And you thought telling him to tell me was enough?" "At the time, yes. I was wrong." Natalie looked down at her hands. "I wish one of you had trusted me enough to decide what the information meant for myself." Michael started to apologize, but Natalie gently stopped him. "I am not asking you to apologize again. I understand why you did it. That does not make it okay." I heard something familiar in those words because I had reached almost the same conclusion minutes earlier. Then Natalie surprised me. "I have been doing it too." She reached into her blazer and took out her engagement ring. Instead of putting it on, she placed it on the kitchen table. "I have had doubts about getting married this quickly." I turned toward her. "You never told me that." "Because I knew you were worried about 9 months being fast, and I did not want you to think my doubts proved you were right." She gave me a small, tired smile. "So every time you asked if I was sure, I acted more certain than I actually felt." That admission forced me to recognize my own version of the same mistake. "Then I owe you something too," I said. Natalie looked at me. I was more worried than I admitted. I kept telling myself that supporting you meant keeping those concerns mostly to myself because I did not want to become the mother who tries to manage her adult daughter's life. Michael looked between us. Apparently all three of us became very good at deciding what everyone else could handle. There was no humor in the observation, but none of us argued with it. The situations were not equally serious, and Natalie knew that too. What mattered was that we had finally stopped pretending silence was always the kinder choice. I reached toward my daughter but stopped before touching her hand. What do you want to do now? She stared at the ring. I do not know yet. For once, I did not offer an answer. Then you do not have to know today. Natalie finally looked at me. I continued, I am not going to investigate him behind your back. I am not going to tell you whether to marry him or leave him. But I do think you deserve the entire truth before you make either decision. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. That is what I want too. She picked up the ring and closed her fingers around it, still without returning it to her hand. He told me part of what happened when we talked earlier, but I was too upset to hear the rest. I told him I would contact him when I was ready. Michael asked, "Are you ready now?" Natalie considered the question before answering. I am ready to listen. That is not the same as being ready to forgive him. She took out her phone. I watched her find his name, and this time neither Michael nor I tried to influence what she should say. Natalie made the call herself. When he answered, she spoke calmly. I am at my parents' house. I want you to come over and tell me everything from the beginning. No more deciding which parts one need to know. Tommy arrived at our house less than 40 minutes later carrying a worn photograph in a plain protective sleeve. Natalie had left her engagement ring on the kitchen table, and he noticed it immediately, but he did not ask her to put it back on. Instead, he sat across from her and placed the photograph between them. This is what I should have shown you months ago, he said. Natalie picked it up carefully. I moved close enough to see it with her. Michael was unmistakable, only much younger, standing beside another man while holding an ultrasound image. Near them stood a little boy. Natalie studied the photograph before looking at her father. That is me? Michael nodded toward the ultrasound image. Yes. Her fiancé explained that his father had kept the photograph for decades before eventually giving it to him, because he remembered Michael as a frightened, expectant father who had needed someone to tell him that fear did not automatically mean failure. As his son grew older, he occasionally heard the story too. The lesson his father attached to it had stayed with him. Being afraid of becoming a family was not the same as being incapable of loving one. Natalie looked at her fiancé. So when you met me, you already knew who I was? No, he said. That is the part one need to make completely clear. And what I said at the clerk's office was wrong. We have not known each other for 30 years. Our families crossed paths before you were born, and I let my nerves turn that into a sentence that made the truth sound stranger than it was. When we first met, I had no idea you were that baby. Meeting you was an accident. I did not seek you out, and your father did not arrange anything. He explained that during their first few dates, nothing about Natalie had connected her to the old story. Then she mentioned her father's name. Later, after seeing a family photograph and meeting Michael in person, he recognized him. He called his own father, confirmed the connection, and understood that Natalie was the daughter Michael had been waiting for when the old photograph was taken. That was when I should have told you, he said. Why did you not? Natalie asked. He did not blame Michael. Because by then I cared about you, and I was afraid the story would make everything between us feel staged. I kept thinking there would be a better moment. Then I waited long enough that telling you also meant admitting I had been keeping it from you. Natalie glanced at Michael. And Dad told you to tell me before you proposed. He did. But you proposed anyway. Yes. There was nothing left for him to hide behind. The coincidence that brought them together had been real. So had the relationship that followed. The deception was narrower than Natalie had feared that morning, but it was still a choice he had made repeatedly after learning the truth. I watched my daughter study the photograph again. For most of the day, other people had possessed pieces of her history while she tried to understand what they meant. Now every factual question had an answer she could evaluate for herself. Her fiancé rested his hands on the table. I am sorry, Natalie. But I do not want you to sign anything today just because I finally told you everything. You were ready to marry the man you believed had been completely honest with you. If you need time to decide what knowing this changes, take it. Natalie looked at the engagement ring beside the photograph, then at the man she had planned to marry. She finally had the whole story. What remained was not another secret. It was her decision. Natalie remained quiet for a long moment, but nobody rushed her. The photograph stayed on the kitchen table beside her engagement ring, and for the first time all day, there was nothing left for anyone else to explain. I believe you, she finally said to her fiancé. I believe we met by accident. I believe you did not recognize me at first, and I believe what we had for 9 months was real. Relief crossed his face, but Natalie continued before he could respond. That does not mean I am ready to marry you. He nodded slowly. I understand. Natalie picked up the ring and held it between her fingers. The problem is not that this connection existed before we met. The problem is that once you understood it, you decided for me that knowing it might damage our relationship. Then every day you waited became another day you made that decision for me. You are right. He said. I was afraid of losing you. I know. But being afraid of losing me cannot become a reason to control what I know. She slipped the ring into her blazer pocket rather than onto her finger. I am not ending our relationship tonight. I am also not setting another wedding date tonight. I need to know whether we can rebuild trust without pretending this disappeared because you finally explained it. He accepted the boundary without bargaining. Then we take the time you need. Natalie corrected him gently. The time we need. If we continue, rebuilding this is not something I do alone. That was the first moment I saw her move beyond shock and into a decision that belonged entirely to her. When he left, he took nothing with him except the understanding that their relationship would continue only under different terms. The old photograph remained with Natalie for the evening. Later, after she went upstairs to the room that had once been hers, Michael and I stayed in the kitchen. I am sorry, he said. For 30 years ago, and for the last few months. I looked at him. Those are two different things. He nodded. I know. I can understand why a younger version of you was ashamed of being afraid. What I cannot accept is that after all these years together, you still thought protecting someone meant choosing what they were allowed to know. Michael did not ask me to forgive him. That helped more than another apology would have. What do you need from me? He asked. I need you to stop making silence into a favor, I said. If something affects me or Natalie, let us decide what we can handle after we know the truth, not before. I can do that. Then do it. Trust will come from what happens next. Over the following weeks, Natalie did not rush back toward marriage, but she did not walk away from her fiancé either. They talked, spent time together, and began rebuilding something more honest than what they had before. Michael became more careful about speaking openly instead of assuming quiet was kinder. I tried to do the same. None of us pretended one conversation had repaired everything. Then one afternoon, Natalie came into the kitchen while I was finishing some work I had brought home from the community college. She rested her purse on the counter and looked at me with a calm expression I had not seen on the morning everything changed. Mom, are you free Friday morning? I can be. Why? She paused, then smiled slightly. I want to go back to the clerk's office. I want you to come with me. Friday morning felt strangely familiar, but Natalie did not. The first time I had accompanied her to the clerk's office, she had arrived certain that knowing what she wanted meant having no doubts. This time she seemed calmer precisely because she was willing to have them. Her fiancé was waiting when we arrived. He greeted me warmly, then looked at Natalie without reaching for her hand or assuming what she had decided. Over the past several weeks, I had watched the two of them rebuild their relationship slowly. There had been no dramatic promises and no attempt to pretend that one honest conversation had restored everything. Natalie had asked harder questions. He had answered them. Sometimes that was all progress looked like. When we approached the counter, the clerk recognized them and smiled. Are we ready this time? Natalie glanced at her fiancé. I expected her to say yes. Instead, she smiled and said, not yet. The clerk looked momentarily surprised, but Natalie continued. We came because we want to understand exactly what we need, how long everything remains valid, and what the process will be when we decide on a date. Her fiancé nodded beside her. There was no disappointment on his face. They asked their questions together, wrote down the information, and left without completing an application. Outside, I finally asked, are you sure about this? Natalie laughed softly. I am sure I do not need to be sure today. Then she looked at the man beside her. We are still together. We are still working toward marriage. But I do not want to get married because postponing it feels embarrassing, or because we need to prove that everything is fine. He said, neither do I. Natalie reached for his hand. It was a small gesture, but it meant more to me than watching her sign paperwork would have. She was not returning to the relationship she had before. They were building a different one, with fewer assumptions and clearer boundaries. Later that afternoon, Natalie came back to our house with me. Michael was waiting in the living room. He had spent part of the morning going through a storage box he had not opened in years. When Natalie entered, he held out a small envelope. There is something I want you to have. Natalie opened it and carefully removed an ultrasound photograph. I recognized it immediately. This was not the old photograph Natalie had seen earlier, it was the actual ultrasound print Michael had been holding in that picture, our own copy from when I was pregnant with her. Natalie looked from the photograph to her father. You kept this? Of course. Michael smiled. But I think it belongs to you now. The story does too. Natalie held the image carefully. Then she looked at him with a hint of humor returning to her face. Any other 30-year secrets? Michael smiled, but his answer was serious. None that I get to decide you should not know. Natalie stepped forward and hugged him. It did not erase what had happened. It did not mean trust had magically returned to where it had been. What it meant was simpler and more believable. Michael understood the boundary now, and Natalie was willing to let him prove that understanding through what he did next. I realized my relationship with her had changed too. I could worry about my daughter without steering her. I could tell her what I thought without expecting her to obey. And she could admit uncertainty without believing that uncertainty made her weak. Watching her leave that evening with the ultrasound photograph tucked safely inside her purse, I understood that the most important thing she had reclaimed was not a piece of family history. It was ownership of the choices that history might influence. Sometimes people keep difficult truths to themselves for reasons that begin with love. They want to spare someone worry, protect a relationship, or avoid reopening an old fear. But perhaps trust asks for something harder, giving the people we love enough truth to make choices we may not be able to make for them. What stayed with me was not that our family suddenly became perfectly honest. We did not. We simply became more willing to admit uncertainty before it hardened into silence. Maybe that is one quiet way families change. Not by agreeing about everything, and not by erasing every mistake, but by learning where protection ends and another person's right to choose begins. If you had been in Natalie's position, how would you have handled the relationship after learning the full truth? And if someone you loved had hidden something because they believed they were protecting you, what would you need from them before trust could begin to return?